On May 15, 1976, at 11:42 in the morning, Soviet Air Force Lieutenant Viktor Belenko sat in the cockpit of a MiG-25 Foxbat, the fastest interceptor in the world, and made a decision that would turn him into a traitor, a hero, and a ghost. His mission orders were clear: patrol the skies along the Soviet-Japanese border near Vladivostok, standard reconnaissance, routine flight, return to base. But Victor had different orders, ones he'd written himself in the silent hours of sleepless nights. He was going to defect, and he wasn't going alone. Hidden beneath a false panel in the maintenance bay of his aircraft, wrapped in military-grade thermal blankets and strapped into a makeshift harness designed to survive, G-forces that could crush human bones, were two people who had no business being inside a supersonic jet fighter: his wife, Ludmila, and their 4-year-old son, Dmitri. If the ground crew had looked closely, they might have noticed the extra weight. If the fuel calculations had been audited, someone might have questioned the discrepancy. If Victor had hesitated for even a second, the entire plan would have collapsed. But no one looked. No one questioned, and Victor did not hesitate. Because in the Soviet Union of 1976, doubt was a luxury reserved for the dead. The world Viktor Belenko lived in was not painted in red and blue like the propaganda posters suggested. It was gray, the gray of concrete apartment blocks in Vladivostok, the gray of winter skies that stretched for months. The gray of lives lived under constant surveillance, where even silence could be misinterpreted as dissent. The Cold War, by the mid-1970s, had settled into a frozen routine. The Berlin Wall stood firm. The arms race continued in laboratories and missile silos scattered across 2 hemispheres. Détente was the official language between Washington and Moscow, but beneath the diplomatic smiles, both sides prepared for annihilation. In the Soviet Far East, near the port city of Vladivostok, the tension was sharper. Japan lay just across the Sea of Japan, a capitalist nation, an American ally, and therefore, in Soviet eyes, a potential staging ground for invasion. The skies above this border were patrolled constantly by MiG-25 Foxbats, aircraft so advanced that Western intelligence agencies had spent years trying to understand them. The MiG-25 was a beast of engineering, capable of flying at Mach 3.2, higher and faster than almost anything NATO could field. Its existence alone was a statement: we are ahead, we are untouchable. But Viktor Belenko knew the truth. He knew that the Foxbat's fuselage was made of steel, not titanium, because the Soviets couldn't produce enough of the latter. He knew the radar system overheated after 30 minutes of continuous use. He knew the engines had an operational lifespan measured in hours, not years, and that every flight brought the aircraft closer to catastrophic failure. He knew, in other words, that the Soviet Union's greatest weapon was also a lie. And lies, Victor had learned, were the only thing the system produced in abundance. Viktor Belenko was born in 1947 in the Ural Mountains, in a town so small it didn't appear on most maps. His father worked in a steel mill. His mother raised chickens and grew potatoes in a plot of land behind their wooden house. They were loyal citizens, the kind who displayed Stalin's portrait even after Khrushchev's denunciation, the kind who sang the Internationale with genuine tears in their eyes. Victor's path to the Air Force was not born of rebellion. It was born of ambition. He excelled in school: mathematics, physics, mechanical engineering. His teachers noticed. The party noticed. At 16, he was selected for the Komsomol aviation program, a training pipeline designed to identify future officers for the Soviet military's elite branches. He was good. Better than good. By 19, he was flying MiG-21s. By 23, he was among the select few chosen to pilot the MiG-25, an honor that came with an apartment in Vladivostok, a modest salary, and the knowledge that he was now part of the machinery that kept the motherland safe. He met Ludmila in 1972 at a state-organized dance for military officers and local factory workers. She was a schoolteacher, 22 years old, with dark eyes and a quiet smile that seemed to carry a sadness she never spoke about. They married 6 months later in a ceremony attended by Victor's commanding officer, who gave a speech about duty and the importance of strong Soviet families. Their son, Dmitry, was born in 1972. For a while, Victor believed in the life he was living. He believed in the mission. He believed in the aircraft he flew. He believed that the West was a decaying empire and that the future belonged to the workers of the world. But belief, like steel, can fracture under pressure. The fracture began with a conversation Victor wasn't supposed to hear. It was late 1974. He was waiting outside his squadron commander's office, summoned for what he assumed was a routine briefing. Through the thin walls he heard two voices, his commander and a man Victor didn't recognize, someone from Moscow, judging by the accent. "The Foxbat program is hemorrhaging resources," the stranger said. "We're cannibalizing parts from one aircraft to keep another flying. The Americans think we have 200 operational units. We have 47. And only 18 of those are airworthy at any given time." There was a long pause. Then his commander's voice, quieter. "Does Brezhnev know?" "Brezhnev knows what we tell him. And we tell him what keeps our funding intact." Victor stood frozen in the hallway. He felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, not shock, but a terrible, clarifying understanding. The system he served was built on deception. Not just deception of the enemy, but deception of itself. That night, he went home and held Dmitry while the boy slept. Ludmila asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. But in his mind, a question had taken root, and it would not stop growing. What am I protecting? Over the following months, Victor began to notice things he had trained himself to ignore. He noticed the way his fellow pilots spoke in whispers, their eyes darting toward doors and windows, even in their own homes. He noticed how Ludmila's school was forced to teach from textbooks that described a version of history that contradicted the stories her own grandmother had told her, stories of famine, of arrests, of neighbors who disappeared in the night. He noticed the fear in Dmitry's kindergarten teacher's face when the boy asked why his grandfather's name wasn't in the family tree they were supposed to draw for class. Victor's father had been arrested in 1953 during one of Stalin's final purges, accused of anti-Soviet agitation. He died in a labor camp before Victor was old enough to remember him. The official record said he never existed, and Victor understood with brutal clarity that in this system truth was a crime. The idea of defection came slowly, like water seeping through concrete. At first it was just a fantasy, something Victor entertained in the seconds before sleep, lying beside Ludmila in their narrow bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a train passing through the rail yards. What if I flew east instead of north? What if I didn't come back? But fantasies in the Soviet Union were dangerous. They led to mistakes. Mistakes led to suspicion. Suspicion led to interrogation rooms with no windows and questions that had no right answers. So Victor kept the fantasy locked away, a secret even from himself. Until the day he found the photograph. It was March 1976. Victor had been tasked with reviewing maintenance logs for his squadron, a bureaucratic chore that usually meant copying numbers from one form to another while a political officer watched to ensure compliance. But on this particular afternoon, the officer was called away. Victor was alone in the records room, and in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet marked Decommissioned Personnel, he found a folder with a name he recognized, Captain Yuri Andropov. Yuri had been Victor's instructor during his initial MiG-25 training. A brilliant pilot, a loyal officer, a man who had flown more hours in the Foxbat than anyone else in the Far East Command. Yuri had disappeared 6 months earlier. The official story was that he'd been transferred to a base in Kazakhstan. But the folder told a different story. Inside were interrogation transcripts. Yuri had been arrested after a KGB informant reported that he'd made a joke, a single, offhand joke, about the quality of Soviet engineering during a dinner with fellow officers. The transcripts documented 3 weeks of interrogation. Yuri denied everything, He swore loyalty. He begged for mercy. The final page was a single line, typed in red ink. Subject deceased during transport. Cause: cardiac arrest. Body disposed per protocol 7A. Victor closed the folder. His hands were shaking. Yuri hadn't defected. He hadn't committed espionage. He had made a joke, and the system had erased him. That night, Victor sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment while Ludmila put Dmitri to bed. The boy had been crying, something about a nightmare, a monster under the bed. When Ludmila came back, she found Victor staring at nothing. "What's wrong?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "If I asked you to trust me, completely, without explanation, could you do it?" Ludmila sat down across from him. Her face was pale. "What are you talking about? I can't tell you, not yet. But I need to know. Do you trust me?" She reached across the table and took his hand. "Yes," she said. And in that moment, Victor made his decision. Planning the defection required precision that bordered on madness. Victor could not write anything down. He could not make phone calls. He could not confide in anyone except Ludmila, and even then, he told her only what she needed to know. The first problem was the aircraft. AMIG-25 was a single-seat interceptor. There was no passenger compartment, no space for stowaways, no official way to carry anyone except the pilot. But Victor knew the plane better than the engineers who designed it. Beneath the cockpit, accessible through a maintenance hatch in the belly of the fuselage, was a narrow equipment bay used to store emergency tools, spare fuses, and survival gear. It was cramped, unheated, and never designed for human occupants, but it was just large enough. Over the course of 3 months, Victor made subtle modifications during his routine pre-flight checks. He installed padding scavenged from old ejection seats. He rerouted a small oxygen line to provide breathable air. He reinforced the harness points to handle the G-forces of a high-speed turn. No one noticed. Or if they did, they assumed it was just another of Victor's obsessive maintenance habits, the kind of behavior expected from a perfectionist pilot. The second problem was the route. Soviet airspace was monitored constantly. Radar stations tracked every aircraft. Flight plans were filed in triplicate. Deviations were investigated immediately. But Victor had one advantage. He knew the gaps. The MiG-25 was so fast that it outran the radar systems designed to track it. If he flew low enough, fast enough, and turned at the right moment, he could disappear from Soviet screens before anyone realized what was happening. The target was Hakodate, Japan, a small city on the northern island of Hokkaido, less than 300 miles from Vladivostok. If he could reach Japanese airspace, he would be safe. If he failed, he would be dead. The night before the flight, Victor didn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room of his apartment, watching the lights of Vladivostok through the window. Ludmila was in the bedroom with Dmitri, holding the boy while he slept. She knew what was coming. Victor had told her 2 days earlier, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd asked for her trust. "We're leaving," he'd said. "All 3 of us." In the plane, Ludmila had gone very still. "That's impossible," she'd said. "It's the only way. Victor, you'll be killed. We'll all be killed. If we stay, we're already dead." She'd looked at him for a long time. Then she'd nodded. "When?" she asked. "Sunday." Now, it was Saturday night. And Victor felt the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him like the atmosphere at 60,000 feet. If he succeeded, he would be a defector, a traitor to the motherland. A symbol of Soviet failure, a man whose name would be cursed in every military academy from Moscow to Murmansk. If he failed, Ludmila and Dmitri would suffer for his crime. They would be interrogated, imprisoned, possibly executed. Their names would be erased. Their lives would become footnotes in a KGB file that no one would ever read. But if he did nothing, if he returned to base tomorrow, filed his flight report, went home, and pretended everything was normal, then Dmitri would grow up in the same gray world that had killed Yuri Andropov. The same world that had erased Victor's father. The same world that turned truth into a crime and silence into survival. Victor stood and walked to the bedroom. Ludmila was awake. She looked at him in the darkness. "Are you sure?" she whispered. He nodded. "Then we go," she said. May 15, 1976 dawned cold and clear over Vladivostok. Victor woke at 5 a.m., dressed in his flight suit, and kissed Ludmila and Dmitri goodbye, as though it were any other day. "I'll see you tonight," he said. Ludmila nodded. She didn't cry. Victor drove to the airbase in his battered Lada sedan, past the checkpoints manned by soldiers who waved him through without inspection. He was a known face, a trusted officer. He parked in his usual spot and walked to the hangar where his MiG-25 waited. The ground crew had already completed the pre-flight checks. The fuel tanks were full. The systems were green. Victor climbed into the cockpit, ran through the startup sequence, and waited. At 10 a.m., his squadron commander briefed the morning patrol. Victor's assignment: a 2-hour flight along the Soviet-Japanese border, monitoring for unauthorized aircraft. Standard procedure. Routine mission. At 11:20 a.m., Victor taxied to the runway. At 11:30 a.m., he received clearance for takeoff. And at 11:42 a.m., as his MiG-25 roared into the sky above the Sea of Japan, Viktor Belenko turned his aircraft 15 degrees east, away from his designated patrol route, and pushed the throttle to full military power. Behind him, in the equipment bay beneath the cockpit, Ludmila held Dmitri against her chest and whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood. The radar operators at Vladivostok Air Defense Command watched Victor's blip move across their screens. For 30 seconds, no one reacted. Then, someone noticed the deviation. By the time they sounded the alarm, Victor was already gone. Inside the MiG-25, the world was noise and violence. The Tumansky R-15 engine screamed at full thrust, shaking the airframe with a fury that felt like the plane was tearing itself apart. The cockpit instruments vibrated so hard that Victor could barely read them. The altimeter climbed past 40,000 feet. The speed indicator touched Mach 2.5. In the equipment bay, Ludmila could hear nothing but the roar of the engines and the pounding of her own heart. The temperature had dropped to near freezing. The oxygen line Victor had installed provided just enough air to keep her and Dmitri conscious, but every breath felt thin and desperate. Dmitri was crying, but Ludmila couldn't hear him. She held him tighter, whispering words she knew he couldn't hear, praying that the harness would hold, that the plane wouldn't break apart, that Victor knew what he was doing. In the cockpit, Victor fought to keep the aircraft stable. He was flying faster and lower than the MiG-25 was designed to handle. The airframe groaned under the stress. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. Engine temperature critical. Fuel consumption excessive. Structural integrity compromised. He ignored them all. The Soviet border was behind him now. Ahead, somewhere in the haze of the Sea of Japan, was Japanese airspace. And behind him, he knew, Soviet air defense was already scrambling. At Vladivostok Air Defense Command, chaos erupted. Contact lost with Delta 7. A radar operator shouted. "Define lost," the duty officer snapped. "He's off the patrol route, heading 0-9-5. Speed. Christ, he's doing Mach 2.8. The duty officer grabbed the phone to the base commander. "We have a possible defection in progress." The word hung in the air like poison. Defection. Within minutes. The entire Soviet air defense network along the Pacific coast went to high alert. Interceptors were scrambled from 3 different bases. Surface-to-air missile batteries powered up. Radar stations from Kamchatka to Sakhalin Island began tracking the rogue MiG. But Victor was faster. By the time the first interceptor got airborne, Victor had already crossed into international airspace. By the time the missile batteries acquired a firing solution, he was out of range. And by the time the base commander in Vladivostok realized what was happening, Viktor Belenko's MiG-25 was screaming toward Japan at a speed no one could match. Japanese Air Self-Defense Force radar operators at Hakodate picked up the contact at 12:17 p.m. Unidentified aircraft bearing 270, speed, Jesus, Mark 2.5. Is it hostile? Unknown. But it's coming straight at us. F-4 Phantom interceptors were launched immediately. Air raid sirens sounded across northern Hokkaido. Civilians were ordered to shelters. The Japanese government, caught completely off guard, scrambled to contact both Washington and Moscow, trying to understand what the hell was happening. But Victor didn't care about any of that. He was 7 minutes from Japanese airspace. 6 minutes. 5. In the equipment bay, Ludmila felt the plane begin to descend. The G-forces shifted, pressing her and Dmitri against the floor of the compartment. She could taste blood in her mouth. Dmitri had stopped crying. His eyes were closed. Please, she thought, please let him be alive. 4 minutes. 3. Victor could see the coastline of Hokkaido now, a thin line of green and brown against the gray ocean. 2 minutes. The radio crackled to life. A voice speaking Russian. Delta 7, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge. Victor didn't respond. Delta 7, this is your final warning. Turn back or you will be shot down. 1 minute. Victor pulled back on the stick, bleeding off speed, angling the nose toward Hakodate Airport. He could see the runway now, a strip of concrete cutting through the farmland. He extended the landing gear. The plane shuddered violently. And then, at 12:24 p.m. on May 15, 1976, Viktor Belenko brought his MiG-25 Foxbat down on Japanese soil. The landing was rough, too fast, too hard. The tires screamed against the asphalt. The brakes locked. The plane skidded sideways, trailing smoke and burning rubber, before finally grinding to a halt at the end of the runway. Victor shut down the engines. For 10 seconds, there was silence. Then he popped the canopy, unstrapped himself, and climbed out onto the wing. Japanese ground crew and security personnel surrounded the aircraft, weapons drawn, shouting in a language Victor didn't understand. He raised his hands and said, in broken English, I defect. I seek asylum. Then he pointed to the equipment bay beneath the cockpit. My family, he said. Please. My family. The maintenance hatch was opened by a Japanese technician whose hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the wrench. When the panel came free, revealing the cramped equipment bay, the crowd of soldiers and airport personnel fell silent. Inside, curled against each other in the dim light, were a woman and a small boy. Ludmila's face was pale, her lips blue from cold and oxygen deprivation. Dmitri was unconscious, his small body limp in her arms. But when the technician reached in to help them, Ludmila's eyes opened. She looked up at the faces staring down at her. Japanese faces, foreign faces, the faces of people she had been taught her entire life to fear. And then she heard Victor's voice, speaking in Russian from somewhere outside the aircraft. It's okay. We're safe. We made it. Ludmila began to cry. Within an hour. The runway at Hakodate Airport was sealed off by the Japanese Self-Defense Force. The MiG-25 was covered with tarps and surrounded by armed guards. Victor, Ludmila, and Dmitri were taken to a military hospital on the outskirts of the city, where doctors examined them for injuries, dehydration, and shock. Dmitri regained consciousness after 20 minutes of oxygen therapy. His first words were, "Where's Papa?" Victor was in the next room, being questioned by Japanese intelligence officers who spoke through a translator. He answered every question calmly, precisely, without emotion. Yes, he was a Soviet Air Force lieutenant. Yes, he had stolen an MiG-25 interceptor. Yes, he intended to defect to the West. No, he would not return to the Soviet Union under any circumstances. And yes, this was the part that made the translator pause. Unsure if he'd heard correctly, he had brought his wife and son with him in the aircraft. The intelligence officer leaned forward. "That's impossible," he said in Japanese. The translator repeated it in Russian. Victor looked at him and said, very quietly, "Nothing is impossible if you're desperate enough." News of the defection reached Moscow within 2 hours. At KGB headquarters on Dzerzhinsky Square, the reaction was immediate and brutal. The file on Lieutenant Viktor Belenko was pulled from the archives. His service record was examined line by line. His family history was reviewed. His psychological evaluations were scrutinized for signs of instability, dissent, or Western sympathies. There were none. Viktor Belenko had been, by every measurable standard, a model Soviet officer, which made his betrayal all the more unforgivable. A team of KGB operatives was dispatched to Vladivostok within hours. They arrived at Viktor's apartment building before sunset, forced open the door, and began a methodical search for evidence. Letters, photographs, documents, anything that might explain why a loyal pilot had turned traitor. They found nothing. The neighbors were interrogated. Viktor's squadron commander was interrogated. The ground crew who had serviced his aircraft were interrogated. Everyone said the same thing. Viktor Belenko had shown no signs of disloyalty. He was quiet, disciplined, and professional. He kept to himself. He followed orders. The only anomaly anyone could recall was that Viktor had requested additional maintenance time for his aircraft in the weeks leading up to the defection, but that wasn't unusual for a pilot known to be obsessive about safety checks. The KGB agents filed their reports with a single, damning conclusion. Subject displayed no detectable warning signs. Defection was premeditated and executed with exceptional operational security. Recommend full review of personnel screening protocols. In other words, Viktor Belenko had fooled everyone, and that terrified the Soviet government more than anything else. Because if one pilot could defect without detection, how many others might be planning the same thing? In Tokyo, the Japanese government found itself in the middle of an international crisis it had never anticipated. The Soviet Union demanded the immediate return of the aircraft, the pilot, and his family. Soviet diplomats invoked international law, citing provisions about stolen military property and the obligation of neutral nations to return defectors to their country of origin. The United States, meanwhile, quietly made it known that it would be very interested in examining the MiG-25 and very grateful to any nation that facilitated such an examination. Japan, caught between two superpowers, stalled for time. Viktor Ludmila and Dmitry were moved from the hospital to a secure facility outside Tokyo, a compound surrounded by high walls and guarded by Japanese soldiers. They were given clean clothes, hot meals, and a small room with 2 beds and a window overlooking a garden. It was the first time in days that Viktor allowed himself to feel something other than fear. He sat on the edge of the bed watching Dmitry sleep and realized that his hands were still shaking. Ludmila sat beside him. She hadn't spoken much since they'd landed, not because she was angry, but because there were no words for what they'd just done. "What happens now?" she asked finally. Viktor shook his head. "I don't know. Will they send us back?" "No," Viktor said. "The Americans won't let that happen. And if they do?" Viktor looked at her. His face was calm, but his eyes were hollow. "Then we die," he said. "But at least we die together." Ludmila took his hand. "I don't regret it," she said. Viktor nodded. "Neither do I." 3 days later, representatives from the Central Intelligence Agency arrived in Tokyo. They met with Viktor in a windowless room inside the secure compound. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in civilian clothes, all speaking fluent Russian. The older of the 2 men introduced himself as Robert. "We'd like to offer you asylum in the United States," he said. "You, your wife, and your son. New identities, financial support, and protection from Soviet retaliation." Viktor studied him carefully. "In exchange for what?" Robert smiled. Everything you know about the MiG-25, Viktor had expected this. He'd known from the moment he turned his plane east that he would become a commodity, a source of intelligence, a propaganda tool, a symbol of Soviet failure. But he'd also known that this was the only way to keep his family safe. "I'll tell you everything," Viktor said, "but I have conditions." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "First, my family is never used for propaganda. No photographs, no interviews, no public appearances. They get to live quietly, without attention. Agreed. Second, I want to see the aircraft one more time before you dismantle it." Robert hesitated. "Why?" Victor's expression didn't change. Because I need to know it was worth it. Robert considered this, then nodded. We can arrange that. The MiG-25 had been transported to a U.S. Air Force facility in Japan, where American engineers and intelligence analysts were conducting the most detailed examination of a Soviet aircraft in the history of the Cold War. What they found astonished them. The Foxbat, which Western intelligence had believed to be a technological marvel, was revealed to be a masterpiece of brute force engineering. The airframe was made of steel because the Soviets lacked the industrial capacity to produce titanium in sufficient quantities. The engines were powerful but inefficient, guzzling fuel at a rate that limited the aircraft's operational range to less than 500 miles. The radar system was crude by Western standards, prone to overheating, and incapable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously. In short, the MiG-25 was fast, but it was not invincible. The revelation changed NATO's entire strategic calculus. Billions of dollars in defense spending had been predicated on the assumption that the Soviet Union possessed air superiority. Now, that assumption was shattered. When Victor was escorted into the hangar to see the aircraft, he stood in silence for a long time, staring at the disassembled fuselage, the exposed engines, the piles of components laid out on tables like the organs of a dissected body. An American engineer approached him. "It's an incredible machine," the engineer said. "Crude, but effective. Whoever designed this understood the limitations of Soviet industry and worked within them brilliantly." Victor nodded slowly. "It was designed to be a lie," he said. The engineer frowned. "What do you mean?" "It was designed to make the West think we were stronger than we are. That was its real purpose. Not to win wars, to prevent them." The engineer didn't respond. Victor turned away from the aircraft and walked toward the exit. He never saw it again. In Moscow, the fallout from Victor's defection continued to escalate. The head of the Soviet Air Force was demoted. The commander of the Vladivostok Air Base was relieved of duty and placed under investigation. The KGB launched a sweeping review of security protocols at every military installation in the Far East, but the damage had already been done. The defection was a humiliation, not just because a pilot had stolen a top-secret aircraft, but because he had done so with his family hidden inside, exposing the incompetence of Soviet security and the desperation of Soviet citizens. The propaganda value for the West was incalculable. And so the Soviet government did what it always did when faced with an inconvenient truth. It rewrote the story. According to the official narrative released by TASS, the Soviet state news agency, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko had not defected. He had been kidnapped by Japanese intelligence operatives who drugged him during a routine patrol and forced him to land his aircraft on Japanese soil. His family, the statement claimed, had been taken hostage to ensure his cooperation. The Soviet people, accustomed to reading between the lines of official propaganda, understood the truth immediately. But they said nothing, because in the Soviet Union, saying nothing was the only form of survival. Viktor, Ludmila, and Dmitry arrived in the United States in late June 1976. They were flown into Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C., in the dead of night, transferred to a safe house in rural Virginia, and given new identities. Victor became John Stevens. Ludmila became Laura. Dmitry, too young to understand what was happening, was simply told that they were on an adventure. For the first few weeks, they lived in a kind of suspended reality, neither Soviet nor American, neither free nor imprisoned. CIA officers came and went, asking Victor endless questions about Soviet air defenses, aircraft specifications, and military doctrine. Victor answered everything, methodically, without emotion. Ludmila spent her days learning English from a tutor the CIA provided. She was a quick study, absorbing vocabulary and grammar with the same intensity she had once applied to teaching Russian literature to schoolchildren in Vladivostok. Dmitry, meanwhile, adapted the way children do, quickly, effortlessly, without looking back. Within a month, he was speaking English with an American accent. Within 2 months, he no longer asked when they were going home. Because home, as he understood it, no longer existed. In September 1976, Victor gave his first and only press conference. It was held in a nondescript conference room in Washington, attended by journalists from major American newspapers and television networks. Victor sat at a table, flanked by U.S. government officials, and read from a prepared statement. He spoke calmly, without dramatics, describing his decision to defect as a matter of conscience. "I did not leave because I hated my country," he said. "I left because I could not raise my son in a system built on lies." The statement was translated into dozens of languages and broadcast around the world. In the Soviet Union, it was never mentioned. Victor's name was removed from all official records. His service history was erased. His photographs were destroyed. In the town where he was born, the school that had once displayed his achievements as an example of Soviet excellence quietly removed the plaque bearing his name. He became, in the eyes of the state, a non-person, a ghost. The years that followed were not easy. Victor found work as an aerospace consultant, advising American defense contractors on Soviet aircraft design. The pay was good, but the work was lonely. He was no longer a pilot. He would never fly again. Ludmila took a job teaching Russian at a community college in suburban Maryland. She was well liked by her students, who found her patient and thoughtful, but she never spoke about her past. When students asked where she was from, she said simply, "Russia, a long time ago." Dmitry grew up American. He attended public school, played Little League baseball, and eventually went to college to study engineering. He rarely spoke Russian anymore. When Victor tried to talk to him about the defection, Dmitry would change the subject. "I don't remember it, Dad," he'd say. "I was 4 years old." But Victor knew that wasn't entirely true. Because sometimes, late at night, Victor would hear Dmitry talking in his sleep, speaking Russian, the language of the country he'd left behind, the language of a life he'd been too young to choose to abandon. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Victor watched the news coverage from his living room in Virginia, staring at the images of crowds tearing down Lenin statues, of the red flag being lowered from the Kremlin, of Boris Yeltsin standing on a tank in Moscow. Ludmila sat beside him, holding his hand. "Do you want to go back?" she asked. Victor shook his head. There's nothing to go back to, and he was right. The country he had fled no longer existed. The system that had erased his name, that had turned truth into a crime and silence into survival, had finally eaten itself alive. But Victor felt no satisfaction, because he understood something that many in the West did not. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not a victory. It was a tragedy. Millions of people had lived their entire lives under that system, believing in it, serving it, sacrificing for it. And when it fell, they were left with nothing. No pensions, no savings, no belief system to replace the one that had been taken from them. Victor had escaped, but he had not been freed. Because freedom, he had learned, was not the absence of oppression. It was the ability to live without fear. And fear, once learned, was never truly forgotten. In 2004, Victor received a letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, postmarked from Moscow, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in Russian, in a handwriting he didn't recognize. The letter was brief. "Lieutenant Belenko, you don't know me, but I knew your father. He was a good man. He died believing in something that didn't exist. You lived long enough to see the truth. I don't know if you made the right choice, but I know you made the only choice you could. May you find peace." The letter was unsigned. Victor read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer in his desk. He never showed it to Ludmila. He never told anyone about it. But sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he would take it out and read it again, searching for meaning in the words of a stranger who had somehow understood what Victor himself had spent decades trying to articulate. That defection was not an act of courage. It was an act of survival. And survival, in the end, was the only victory the Cold War ever offered. Victor Belenko died on September 24, 2023, in a hospice facility in Illinois. He was 76 years old. Ludmila had passed away 5 years earlier, from cancer. Dmitri, now in his 50s, sat beside his father in the final hours, holding his hand the way Victor had once held his on that terrifying flight across the Sea of Japan. "Do you have any regrets?" Dmitri asked. Victor's eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow. For a long time, Dmitri thought his father hadn't heard him. Then Victor spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Only one." "What?" "That I had to choose." Dmitri didn't understand. But Victor didn't explain. Because there was nothing to explain. The Cold War had been a conflict without winners, only survivors. And even the survivors carried scars that never healed. Victor had saved his family. But he had lost his country, his identity, and the version of himself that had once believed the world could be divided into heroes and villains, East and West, freedom and tyranny. The truth, he had learned, was more complicated and more terrible. In the decades since Victor Belenko's defection, the story has been told and retold in books, documentaries, and declassified intelligence reports. He has been called a hero, a traitor, a symbol, and a ghost. But the people who knew him best, the few who remained, remembered him differently. They remembered a man who loved his son, a man who held his wife's hand in the darkness, a man who made an impossible choice because staying would have been worse than leaving. The MiG-25 he flew that day was eventually returned to the Soviet Union, in pieces after American engineers had finished studying it. It was never reassembled. The wreckage was stored in a warehouse outside Moscow, where it remains to this day, a monument to a weapon that was designed to deceive and a man who refused to be part of the lie. The Cold War is over. The Berlin Wall is gone. The Soviet Union is a memory, but the stories remain. Stories of people who lived in the space between two empires, two ideologies, two versions of the truth. People who made choices that should never have been necessary. People who paid the price for surviving. Victor Belenko was one of those people, and his story, like so many others from that frozen, silent war, should never be forgotten. Because it reminds us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is a quiet man sitting in a cockpit. His family hidden beneath him, flying toward an uncertain future because the past had become unbearable. Sometimes courage is choosing to live, even when the cost of living is everything you've ever known. If stories like this make you reflect on the choices people make when the world offers no good options, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories, stories of quiet heroism, silent sacrifice, and impossible decisions that deserve to be remembered. Because history is not made by nations, it is made by individuals. And every individual, in the end, is just trying to survive.